7 out of 10 intelligence leads are dismissed within the first 24 hours. Not because they are false, but because they cannot be verified fast enough. This is the life story of a system built to chase truth under pressure, shaped by secrecy, doubt, and the constant risk of being wrong. It did not begin with mystery. It began with paperwork, with slow rooms full of files, and with governments trying to make sense of scattered signals across continents. The early shape of it was not a person, not yet a private investigator in Arizona or an analyst inside a secure building, but a method collection, verification, action, lesser-known fact, design, compromise. Early intelligence systems deliberately limited data intake to what analysts could read in 8-hour shifts, capping daily reports at roughly 200 pages to avoid overload. In the deserts of the American Southwest. Long before stories of strange sightings and unexplained patterns, the land itself created conditions for surveillance. Wide skies, low population density, and proximity to military testing ranges turned Arizona into a quiet observation ground. Not for aliens, not for mitzvot, for tracking, for calibration, for watching without being seen. Lesser-known fact, weather terrain impact. The dry air of Arizona improves long-range optical clarity by up to 30% compared to humid regions, which is why early reconnaissance testing favored desert environments. At the same time, inside institutions like the CIA, a different version of this system was growing, one that relied not on open land, but on human networks, informants, defectors, intercepted communications. The parents of this system were not just agencies, but fear, competition, and the need to predict what could not be openly observed. Lesser-known fact, command doctrine shift. After the Cold War intensified in the 1950s, doctrine shifted from reactive intelligence to predictive modeling, increasing funding for long-term threat forecasting by over 60%. Early prototypes of this system were flawed. Analysts trusted patterns too quickly. Field investigators trusted instincts too much. Connections were drawn where none existed, and real threats were sometimes ignored because they looked strange to be credible. Lesser-known fact test results. A 1960s internal review found that over 40% of flagged higher-risk anomalies were later attributed to misinterpreted routine activity, such as weather balloons or civilian transmissions. In its childhood, the system struggled with translation not just of language, but of meaning. A signal intercepted in one region could carry cultural nuance, lost entirely on the analyst reading it thousands of miles away. A footprint in desert sand could be dismissed as nothing or misread as something significant. Lesser-known fact, crew training detail. Early field operatives received less than 20 hours of cultural training before deployment, which led to repeated misinterpretations of local behaviors. Small changes began to matter, not new technology, but better questions. Instead of asking, "What is this?" the system learned to ask, "What does this resemble?" and later, "What does this contradict?" That shift, subtle but critical, reduced false positives over time. Lesser-known fact, production issue. Early intelligence reports were often delayed by up to 72 hours due to manual transcription processes, limiting their real-time usefulness. In Arizona, the private investigator became a visible extension of this larger machine, not officially connected, often working alone, but shaped by the same logic. Follow patterns, eliminate noise, trust nothing fully. The cases seemed local missing persons, unusual movements, unexplained lights, but the method behind them was inherited from something much larger. Lesser-known fact, supply constraint. Independent investigators in the 1980s often lacked access to centralized databases, forcing reliance on physical records that could take days to retrieve. Growth came quietly. Databases replaced filing cabinets. Satellites replaced guesswork. Patterns that once took weeks to identify could now emerge in minutes. The system expanded not by becoming smarter, but by becoming faster. Lesser-known fact, countermeasure. As surveillance improved, counter-surveillance tactics evolved, including deliberate signal spoofing that could mislead tracking systems by mimicking known patterns. Standardization followed. Reports were formatted. Language was controlled. Uncertainty was quantified. Words like possible, likely, and confirmed were assigned probability ranges. This was not about clarity, it was about consistency. Lesser known fact, medical psychological effect. Analysts exposed to continuous ambiguous data. Streams showed increased rates of decision fatigue, with measurable drops in accuracy after 6 hours of uninterrupted analysis. The private investigator, working under open skies, began to mirror this structure in smaller ways. Notes became structured, observations categorized, even intuition was broken down into repeatable steps. But something remained different. Field work still required presence, still required standing in the same place where something strange had happened. Lesser known fact, battlefield improvisation. Investigators often used improvised stakeout techniques, such as rotating observation points every 90 minutes, to avoid detection in low population areas. At its peak, the system reached a moment where it seemed nearly omniscient. Data from space, ground, and human sources converged. Patterns aligned. Predictions improved. There were operations where outcomes were anticipated with startling accuracy, not because the system knew everything, but because it knew enough. Lesser-known fact test result. During late Cold War exercises, predictive intelligence models correctly anticipated adversary movements within a 12-hour window in approximately 65% of simulations. In Arizona, a defining scenario played out repeatedly, though rarely documented in public detail. Reports of unusual activity, sometimes aircraft, sometimes lights, sometimes patterns of movement, would trigger layered observation. Local investigators noticed first, regional systems confirmed or denied. Federal structures absorbed the data. Quietly, lesser-known fact, command doctrine shift. Protocol required that unexplained aerial observations be logged, but not escalated unless corroborated by at least 2 independent sensor systems. It worked there because of alignment. Sparse terrain, reduced noise, clear skies improve visibility, and the layered structure from individual observer to centralized analysis allow for filtering before action. Lesser known fact, weather terrain, impact, nighttime temperature. Drops in desert regions can create atmospheric distortions that alter perceived distance of lights by up to 50%. But the cost was always present. For the analyst, it was fatigue. For the investigator, it was isolation. For both, it was uncertainty that knowledge that being wrong could mean missing something critical or chasing something meaningless. Lesser known fact, medical psychological effect. Long-term investigators report elevated stress markers similar to those found in emergency responders, particularly due to prolonged exposure to unresolved cases. Sleep patterns broke down. Nights became work hours. Days became recovery. The line between professional observation and personal perception blurred, especially when cases remained unresolved for years. Lesser-known fact, crew training detail. Training programs began incorporating psychological resilience modules after studies showed burnout rates exceeding 30% within 5 years of fieldwork. And then, slowly, it began to age. Not because it failed, but because the environment changed. Data became too abundant. Signals multiplied. The problem shifted from lack of information to excess of it. Lesser-known fact, supply constraint. By the early 2000s, intelligence systems processed more data in a single day than was handled in an entire year during the 1970s. New technologies emerged: automation, machine learning, systems that could detect patterns without human fatigue. The old methods, cheerful, deliberate, human-driven, began to feel slow. Lesser-known fact countermeasure. Automated systems introduce new vulnerabilities, including adversarial inputs designed to mislead algorithms without being detectable to human reviewers. The private investigator, still working under the same skies, became something different, less central, more niche. The work did not disappear, but it changed shape. Cases became more digital, less physical. Clues moved from footprints to metadata. Lesser-known fact production issue. Transition to digital records created gaps where older case files were never fully digitized, leading to permanent data loss in some jurisdictions. And yet, the legacy remains. Modern systems still rely on the same foundation: observe, question, verify. The language has changed, the tools have changed, but the structure of thought remains familiar. Lesser-known fact design, compromise. Even advanced AI-assisted analysis tools still limit output. Summaries to human-readable lengths, often under 1,000 words, to maintain decision usability. Later designs copied the speed, the scale, the automation, but they also inherited the same limitation: the need for interpretation. Data alone does not decide. Someone, somewhere, still has to look at it and choose what it means. Lesser known, fact command doctrine shift. Current doctrine emphasizes human-in-the-loop decision-making, requiring final validation by trained analysts. Despite automated recommendations, what militaries and agencies learned was not how to see everything, it was how to live with not seeing enough. The system never truly solved uncertainty. It learned to operate within it, and in quiet places, under wide skies, the work continues not as myth, not as conspiracy, but as a method that has outlived every story told about it. 11 minutes was the average window in which a field report could be judged actionable, before it began to decay in value. The story continues at the point where speed started to replace certainty, and where the system began to believe that faster answers might feel like truer ones. Inside secure rooms, far from the open deserts of Arizona, the doctrine tightened. Information was no longer simply gathered, it was ranked, scored, and filtered before a human even saw it. Signals, intelligence, imagery, and human reporting were fused into single streams, each assigned confidence levels that could rise or fall in seconds. Lesser-known fact production issue. Early multi-source fusion systems in the 1990s frequently misaligned timestamps across data feeds, creating false correlations that took years to identify and correct. The private investigator, still working outside that architecture, began to feel the difference without always understanding it. Leads that once felt unique now appeared already, categorized somewhere else, as if the conclusion had been reached before the question was fully asked. It created a subtle pressure: either confirm what the system suggested or risk being dismissed. Lesser-known fact psychological effect. Studies of analysts showed a measurable bias toward confirming system-generated hypotheses, increasing agreement rates by nearly 25% even when contradictory evidence existed. This was not a conspiracy. It was a byproduct of design. Systems built to reduce uncertainty inevitably begin to prefer answers over ambiguity, and in that preference, strange things, unexplained observations, were often pushed to the margins. Lesser-known fact design compromise. Many intelligence platforms intentionally deprioritize outlier data below a certain statistical threshold. Even though rare events are often the most significant, the idea of the true shape of the Earth did not enter as a literal question within these systems. It entered sideways, through anomalies. Radar returns that bent in ways they should not, visual sightings that did not align with known aircraft profiles, satellite data that seemed to contradict ground observations, only to later resolve under closer inspection. Lesser-known fact test results. Atmospheric refraction can shift apparent object positions by several degrees, enough to misclassify altitude by thousands of meters in extreme conditions. For analysts trained in strict frameworks, these anomalies posed a problem, not because they suggested something extraordinary, but because they disrupted clean categorization. The system preferred explanations that fit existing models, equipment error, environmental distortion, misidentification, and often those explanations were correct. Lesser-known fact countermeasure. Military testing programs have historically used deliberately ambiguous flight profiles to obscure capabilities, resulting in misidentification even within internal tracking systems. In Arizona, the investigator encountered the ground-level version of this tension. Reports from witnesses carried details that did not fit neatly into standard explanations, not impossible details, just inconsistent ones. Distances that changed, speeds that varied, shapes that seemed to shift depending on the angle of observation. Lesser-known fact: weather, terrain impact, heat gradients in desert environments can create mirage effects that distort perceived object shapes, sometimes elongating or compressing them visually. Small adjustments in method followed. Interviews became more structured. Timelines were cross-checked against environmental data: temperature, wind, known flight activity. The work became less about belief and more about elimination. Lesser-known fact: crew training detail, advanced interview protocols, reduced false memory incorporation by up to 40%. When witnesses were asked to reconstruct events in reverse chronological order, growth of the system at this stage was not just technical, it was procedural. Manuals expanded, checklists multiplied. Every anomaly had a pathway, every report a format. The goal was not to explain everything immediately, but to ensure that nothing slipped through without being recorded. Lesser-known fact: supply constraint. Expansion of data storage capabilities lagged behind collection rates in the early 2000s, forcing selective retention policies that discarded lower priority records. At its peak, the system reached the paradox. It could see more than ever before, yet confidence in what it saw did not increase at the same rate. The volume of data introduced new kinds of uncertainty, conflicting signals, overlapping interpretations, and the constant possibility of hidden variables. Lesser-known fact: test result. Simulation studies showed that increasing data inputs beyond a certain threshold actually reduced decision accuracy due to cognitive overload. Even with automated assistance, a defining scenario emerged repeatedly in both institutional and field contexts. An unusual observation would be logged centenarial, something transient. Sensors might partially confirm it. Witnesses might disagree on details. The system would process it, assign probabilities, and often conclude with a non-committal assessment. Lesser-known fact: command, doctrine, shift. Intelligence reporting standards introduced categories like unresolved and insufficient data to formally acknowledge limits of analysis rather than forced conclusions. It worked not perfectly, but effectively because it avoided escalation based on uncertainty. Most anomalies resolved over time. Equipment errors were identified. Natural phenomena explained. Patterns that seemed strange at first became ordinary under repetition. Lesser-known fact: countermeasure. Calibration errors in radar systems have historically produced ghost tracks that mimic high-speed objects, sometimes persistent for hours before detection, but some cases did not resolve. They remained in the system, neither confirmed nor dismissed, accumulating over years. For the investigator, these became the most difficult, not because they proved anything extraordinary, but because they resisted closure. Lesser-known fact: psychological effect. Unresolved cases are associated with higher long-term stress levels than confirmed negative cases. Due to lack of cognitive closure, the cost deepened here. It was no longer just fatigue, it was doubt. Doubt in observations, in memory, in interpretation, The system demanded objectivity, but the human element could never be fully removed. Every decision carried the weight of uncertainty, lesser-known fact, medical effect. Chronic exposure to ambiguous threat assessment has been linked to elevated cortisol levels and disrupted sleep cycles in both analysts and field investigators. For those inside institutions like the CIA, the pressure took a different form. The expectation was not just to analyze, but to be right often enough to justify the system itself. Mistakes were studied, corrected, documented, but the possibility of unseen error always remained. Lesser-known fact, production issue. Internal audits have shown that post-analysis corrections can take months to propagate through all dependent reports, leaving outdated conclusions in circulation. As the system aged further, replacement did not come as a single innovation. It came in layers. Machine learning models began to identify patterns without explicit programming. Automated anomaly detection reduced reliance on manual review. The role of the human shifted again from observer to overseer, lesser-known fact, design compromise. Early AI models and intelligence analysis were deliberately constrained to avoid autonomous decision-making, limiting their ability to act on detected anomalies without human approval. The private investigator, now operating in a world saturated with data, adapted or faded, some integrated digital tools, database access, signal tracking, open source intelligence. Others remained rooted in physical observation, focusing on cases that machines could not easily interpret. Lesser-known fact, battlefield improvisation. Modern investigators often combine open source satellite imagery with ground-level verification, cross-referencing changes over time to identify inconsistencies. The idea of hidden truths of something fundamental being concealed persisted not because of evidence, but because of gaps. Where the system could not provide clear answers, speculation filled the space. This was not new. It was a recurring pattern in the history of incomplete information. Lesser-known fact, command doctrine shift, communication strategies increasingly emphasize transparency about uncertainty to reduce misinterpretation and prevent escalation of unsupported theories. Legacy formed quietly, not in headlines, not in dramatic revelations, but in the persistence of method. Observe carefully, question assumptions, accept limits. The system did not uncover a terrifying hidden shape of the earth. It revealed something else instead. Perception is fragile, and that certainty is often constructed, not discovered. Lesser-known fact, test result. Controlled perception experiments have shown that human observers can misjudge size, distance, and speed by over 50% under low visibility. Conditions. What remained was not a final answer, but a discipline. A way of approaching the unknown without surrendering to it. Later systems inherited the tools, the speed, the reach, but they also inherited the same constraint, the need for human judgment in the face of incomplete data. Lesser-known fact, crew training detail. Modern intelligence training places increased emphasis on cognitive bias recognition, with dedicated modules exceeding 40 hours in some programs.